grandfather ignored at family gathering, until he reveals something that shocks everyone. The family gathering was buzzing with laughter and chatter as relatives greeted one another with hugs and excitement. It was one of the few times a year when everyone managed to set aside their busy lives to come together, filling the large house with voices and stories. But, amid the crowd and festivities, one figure stood quietly at the edge of the room, his presence barely acknowledged. An elderly man, standing slightly hunched, his white hair combed neatly to one side. This was Joseph, the patriarch of the family, and despite his years of wisdom, he seemed strangely out of place. Before I continue, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on the next fantastic stories. Joseph observed the interactions around him, his wrinkled hands holding a small cup of tea that had long since gone cold. He wore a gentle smile as he watched his grandchildren, now young adults, engrossed in their own worlds, sharing tales of success, new relationships, and future plans. But to Joseph, it seemed as though he were more of a spectator than a part of their lives. His own stories, his own experiences, had faded into the background, just like the faint scent of his tea. One by one, family members drifted by him without much more than a passing nod. Some, like his eldest son, Mark, seemed almost annoyed at his presence, as if Joseph's quiet, observant demeanor was somehow a burden. Even his daughter-in-law, Lisa, seemed preoccupied, busying herself with hosting duties, her polite smiles directed at everyone except him. In the corner of the room, Joseph noticed a few whispered glances and felt the unmistakable sting of being silently dismissed. Joseph's mind wandered to past gatherings, when he had once been at the center of these events, guiding his children, offering advice, and sharing stories of his youth. But as the years passed, it seemed his family had lost interest in the life he had once led. To them, he was just an old man whose time had come and gone, someone who didn't belong in the fast-paced world they inhabited. He could feel the subtle sting of rejection, but he bore it with quiet dignity, his heart heavy with an ache that went unnoticed. He thought of leaving early, slipping out before anyone noticed, but something in him resisted. He had come here today for a reason, though he doubted anyone else remembered its importance. Today marked his 85th birthday, a milestone he hadn't intended to celebrate extravagantly, but he had hoped that his family might at least acknowledge it. Yet here he was, standing alone in a room full of his loved ones, none of whom seemed aware of the significance of the day. Suddenly, his youngest granddaughter, Emily, approached him. She was only 18, a gentle soul, and seemed to sense his loneliness amid the crowd. She offered him a shy smile, her eyes filled with a kindness that he had not felt from anyone else that evening. "Grandpa, are you okay?" she asked softly, her voice tinged with genuine concern. Joseph's heart warmed at her thoughtfulness, and he patted her hand, nodding with a reassuring smile. "I'm fine, my dear. Just enjoying the view," he replied, though his words held a subtle sadness. But Emily wasn't easily convinced. "You look lonely," she whispered, squeezing his hand. She had always felt a special connection with her grandfather, often seeking him out when the noise of the world felt overwhelming. To her, he was more than just an old man, he was a source of comfort, a steady presence. "Did anyone wish you a happy birthday yet?" she asked, her brow furrowing in concern. Joseph shook his head, his smile bittersweet. "No, but that's all right. Birthdays are just numbers at my age." Emily's face fell, and Joseph could see the disappointment in her eyes. She looked around the room, as if willing someone else to notice, to remember. But no one seemed aware, too caught up in their own conversations and laughter. In that moment, Emily felt a flicker of frustration at her family, at their blindness to the kindness and wisdom that Joseph offered so selflessly, even when they disregarded him. She wanted to shout, to demand that they see him as she did, but she held back, uncertain of how to change their indifference. Joseph, noticing her expression, gave her hand a gentle squeeze. "It's all right, Emily," he said softly, his voice steady. "People often forget the quieter things in life. It's just how it is." But in his heart, he felt the sadness deepen, the realization that he had become invisible to the very people he had spent his life raising and supporting. The rest of the evening unfolded as if Joseph were merely part of the room's decor. He stayed where he was, observing his family as they chatted in animated groups, occasionally glancing his way without real acknowledgement. He watched Mark, his eldest son, hold court in the center of the room, laughing loudly and engaging everyone with stories of his latest business success. Mark had always been the confident, ambitious one, a trait Joseph had once admired, though now he sensed that confidence had turned into something else, pride, perhaps, or a kind of self-importance that distanced him from others. Joseph's daughter-in-law, Lisa, flitted around, ensuring the guests' glasses were filled and that the trays of hors d'oeuvres were constantly replenished. Though she was polite and courteous, she didn't make an effort to include Joseph in her rounds. Her gestures seemed more obligatory than genuine, and she avoided his gaze whenever she came near, perhaps afraid that he might ask for her attention. For years, Joseph had felt her reluctance to engage with him, as though his presence disrupted the image of a perfect family she worked so hard to maintain. Nearby, his other grandchildren were deeply engrossed in their phones, barely looking up except to show one another photos or to laugh at an internet meme. They seemed worlds apart from the life Joseph had once known, where gatherings had been about connection, laughter, and storytelling. Now, screens held more allure than shared memories, and it saddened him to see how little they seemed to value real connection. They laughed and joked with each other, but there was no depth, no lasting moment created, just a blur of digital noise. Joseph looked down at his wrinkled hands, thinking of all they had built. These hands had worked through long days to put food on the table, had wiped tears and held tiny, trusting fingers as he led his children through their first steps in life. His hands had been strong once, but now they felt out of place, foreign. It was as if the strength they'd once held meant nothing to those around him now, as though age had erased their worth. He wondered if they remembered the nights he'd stayed up with them when they were sick, or the times he'd sacrificed his own needs to give them more than he'd ever had. As the evening wore on, a few other family members, distant cousins and old friends, arrived and were immediately absorbed into the bustle of conversation. Joseph greeted them with polite nods, but they only returned distracted smiles, quickly moving on to those they considered more interesting. He sat by the window, the sounds of laughter and chatter filling the room, but he felt increasingly like an outsider in his own family. He wondered how he'd become so invisible to the people who mattered most to him. Emily continued to stay by his side, occasionally giving his hand a reassuring squeeze or smiling at him with genuine warmth. She seemed to sense his growing discomfort, and every now and then, she would shoot a glare toward her cousins or a sigh of frustration when they ignored him. "It's not fair, Grandpa," she whispered at one point, her voice laced with both anger and sadness. "They don't see you like I do. They don't know everything you've done for them." Joseph gave her a gentle smile, appreciating her loyalty and kindness. "People see what they want to see, Emily," he said softly. "Sometimes, it's easier for them to ignore what doesn't fit into their busy lives. It's not their fault, really. We all get caught up in our own worlds." He spoke with a wisdom that came from a lifetime of watching people grow and change, understanding that often, the most valuable things were the first to be forgotten. At one point, Lisa organized everyone for a group photo, arranging them around the living room for the perfect shot. She made a point of placing the younger grandchildren in front, while Mark and the other adults stood in the middle, laughing and adjusting their poses. Joseph stood off to the side, waiting to see if anyone would call him over. He watched as the camera flashed and captured their smiles, their joy, their shared moment, one in which he had no place. Emily, noticing this exclusion, tried to pull him over, but her older cousins laughed it off, telling her, "Grandpa doesn't need to be in the picture, he's already had his turn." They dismissed her protest with a chuckle, patting her shoulder in a patronizing way, while Joseph shook his head and gently pulled his hand from Emily's grasp. He didn't want to cause a scene. He had already learned that his attempts to join in were often seen as an inconvenience. As the evening wore on, Joseph thought about leaving, wondering if his absence would even be noticed. He could return to his quiet apartment, to his books and his memories, where he didn't feel like an intruder in his own family's celebration. But part of him resisted. He had come here hoping, perhaps foolishly, that someone might remember his birthday, that one of his children might offer more than a passing nod. After all, he had watched each of them grow, cared for them, sacrificed for them, even as they now seemed to drift further and further away. Just as he was about to make his way to the door, he overheard Mark and Lisa discussing plans for the family estate, a property he had worked his entire life to build and maintain. They spoke as if he were already gone, as if his years of dedication to providing for them had faded into irrelevance. The realization struck him deeply, like a blow to the chest. They had already dismissed him in their minds, planning futures that didn't include him, taking his sacrifices for granted. Emily noticed his reaction and followed him to the edge of the room, her face filled with concern. "Grandpa, don't listen to them," she whispered fiercely. "They are being selfish, thinking only of themselves." Joseph looked at her, his eyes glistening with both sorrow and gratitude. "Emily, my dear, I don't hold it against them," he replied softly. "But perhaps it's time they remembered that there's more to life than what they see in front of them." A quiet resolve began to form within Joseph. He knew he hadn't come here to be ignored, and he wasn't ready to fade into the background just yet. He took a deep breath, feeling the years of silence and patience well up within him. He glanced around the room, his gaze resting briefly on each family member, his heart brimming with both sorrow and love. It was time they saw him for who he truly was, and he knew exactly how to do it. As the family continued in their lively conversations, Joseph watched from his corner, his mind settling on a decision. For too long, he had kept quiet, his words buried in the respect he had for his family and their lives, but tonight, something in him shifted. The years of unnoticed sacrifices and fading memories of his contributions came rushing forward, and he felt a quiet but steady resolve to remind them all of who he was and what he had done. Joseph gently placed his teacup on a nearby table and straightened his posture. Emily, who had been quietly watching him, noticed the change and looked at him with curiosity and concern. "Grandpa, are you all right?" she whispered, sensing the shift in his demeanor. He gave her a gentle nod and a reassuring pat on the shoulder, his gaze fixed on the bustling scene before him. "I think it's time for me to say a few words, Emily," he murmured, his voice filled with a quiet strength she hadn't heard before. With a calm yet deliberate stride, Joseph walked toward the center of the room. The conversation gradually died down as his presence became impossible to ignore. His family members turned to him, some with puzzled expressions, others with faint looks of impatience, as if his interruption were an inconvenience. Mark raised an eyebrow, clearly curious but a bit irritated by the unplanned disruption. "Dad, is there something you wanted to say?" he asked, his tone polite but distant. Joseph gave a small nod, meeting each of their gazes in turn. "I realize this gathering is meant to bring us all together," he began, his voice steady yet filled with an underlying emotion that drew everyone's attention. "And I don't mean to intrude. But as I stand here, surrounded by my family, I can't help but feel forgotten." His words lingered in the air, casting a hush over the room. The family members exchanged glances, unsure of how to respond, caught off guard by his candid admission. He looked down briefly, gathering his thoughts before continuing. "I've watched each of you grow," he said, his voice softer but filled with warmth. "I remember the first steps you took, the times I held you close when you were scared, the long nights I spent working to make sure you had a safe home. I gave everything I had to this family, and I've never once regretted it. But tonight, I see how much I've faded from your lives, like an old photograph tucked away in a forgotten album." The silence grew heavier as his words settled over the room. Lisa looked down, suddenly fidgeting with her glass, while Mark shifted uncomfortably, the weight of his father's words pressing on him. Joseph could see the faint flicker of recognition in their faces, but he knew he had to continue. "It's easy to forget what's been given when the memory of that giving has become so distant," he said, his gaze steady. "But I'm still here. I'm still part of this family, whether or not it's easy for you to remember." A few murmurs of discomfort echoed among the younger members, who glanced at one another, unsure how to react. One of Joseph's grandsons, clearly embarrassed, muttered, "We didn't mean to make you feel that way, Grandpa." But Joseph shook his head gently. "I'm not asking for apologies or sympathy," he replied, his voice firm yet kind. "I simply wanted to remind you all that there is more to family than what's seen in the present." Emily, standing close by, felt a surge of pride as she listened to her grandfather's words. She had always known he held a quiet strength, a wisdom that came from years of experience and sacrifice. But seeing him speak up, sharing his truth so openly, made her realize just how much depth and resilience lay within him. She caught his eye and gave him a supportive smile, which he returned with a gentle nod. Joseph looked over at Mark and Lisa, his expression softening as he saw the hints of guilt in their faces. "Mark, Lisa," he said, addressing them directly, "I know you have your own lives, your own families to care for. And I admire the hard work you put into building them. But remember, everything you have now was made possible because of the foundation that was built for you. Your mother and I worked hard to give you that. And now, it's all too easy to look forward without glancing back." Lisa's face flushed, her gaze dropping to the floor as the weight of his words settled over her. Mark nodded slowly, his brow furrowed as if suddenly realizing the truth of his father's statement. The younger members of the family, who had grown up taking their comfortable lives for granted, looked at Joseph with a new awareness, seeing him not just as an old man, but as the cornerstone of the family they had overlooked. With a deep breath, Joseph turned to face the entire room, his gaze steady and unwavering. "Perhaps you all think my best years are behind me, that I have nothing left to offer," he said quietly, his voice filled with a mixture of sadness and strength. "But that's not true. I have stories, lessons, and a lifetime of experience to share. And someday, when I'm gone, you may realize that these things were more valuable than anything money could buy." The silence in the room was absolute as Joseph's words resonated, each one a reminder of the life he had led, the sacrifices he had made, and the legacy he hoped to leave behind. He could see the impact on their faces, the dawning understanding of how much he had been overlooked, and he felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that, finally, he had been heard. For the first time in years, they were looking at him with something other than indifference or polite smiles. They were seeing him, truly seeing him. As Joseph's words hung in the air, the silence that followed was thick, almost reverent. His family, so used to his quiet presence, now looked at him as if seeing him for the first time. Mark's confident demeanor wavered, replaced by a look of discomfort and something else, perhaps realization, perhaps regret. Lisa shifted beside him, her eyes meeting Joseph's only briefly before flickering away, as if avoiding the weight of his gaze. The younger family members looked back and forth, uneasy with the tension they didn't fully understand. To them, Grandpa had always been a peripheral figure, a gentle presence who drifted in and out of family gatherings without demanding attention. But hearing him speak, seeing the emotion in his eyes, stirred something unfamiliar in them. They began to wonder about the man behind the quiet smiles, the sacrifices they had only vaguely heard of, and the life he had lived. Emily stood close by, her heart swelling with pride and an intense, protective love. She knew how much this moment had cost her grandfather, and she was relieved to see her family's reactions, even if they were only beginning to understand what he had been through. She gently took his hand, squeezing it as if to say, "I'm here with you." Joseph looked at her with a warmth that went beyond words, grateful for her presence and the quiet strength she gave him. Clearing his throat, Mark took a hesitant step forward. His usually assured tone was softer, as if humbled by the realization of what he'd overlooked. "Dad, I think we've all taken you for granted," he began, glancing around the room as if seeking affirmation. "I mean, it's not that we don't care. I guess we just forget. Life gets busy, you know?" He trailed off, his words feeling hollow, and he looked down, visibly struggling to find the right things to say. Joseph met his son's gaze with a calm understanding. "Life is always busy, Mark. And it's easy to forget things, especially when they seem like they'll always be there. But you must understand, there comes a point when things slip away, quietly, before you even realize what's been lost." He paused, letting his words settle. "And sometimes, all that remains is a memory of what was once cherished but neglected in its time." Lisa bit her lip, her face reflecting a mix of regret and discomfort. She, too, had grown accustomed to Joseph's quiet presence, to his tendency to fade into the background. In her mind, he had always been there, almost like part of the furniture, reliable, unchanging, easy to overlook. But now, hearing him speak so candidly, she realized how wrong she had been to assume he would always be around without needing acknowledgement. Feeling compelled to break the tension, one of the grandsons, Andrew, spoke up. He was a young man of 20, often seen as impulsive but genuine. "Grandpa, can you tell us more about, well, your life?" he asked, his voice hesitant yet sincere. "I mean, I feel like we hardly know anything about you, other than, you know, the stories Mom and Dad told us." His question surprised everyone. But it also seemed to open a door, inviting Joseph to share the memories he had long held close. Joseph's face softened, and a small smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "Well, there's quite a lot to tell," he said, glancing at each of them. "But I suppose I could start with a story from when I was young. A time when things were much simpler, yet much harder, too." He looked around, and, seeing the genuine curiosity in their faces, began to speak, his voice carrying the strength of a memory long preserved. He spoke of his youth, of growing up in a small, humble home and working long hours to help his family. He recounted tales of hard winters, of friendships formed in hardship, and of dreams he had nurtured in his heart while working to survive. His family listened intently, caught up in his words, the warmth of his memories creating a sense of intimacy they hadn't expected. For the first time, they glimpsed the life he had lived before he became grandpa, the man with dreams, the man who had known struggle and resilience. As he continued, Joseph noticed the change in their faces. They looked at him with newfound respect, a glimmer of awe at the challenges he had overcome. For the younger generation, who had been raised in comfort, the idea of working from dawn until dusk just to make ends meet was a foreign concept. The world he described seemed like something out of a novel, distant, almost mythical, yet they knew it was real, that he had lived it. Eventually, Joseph paused, glancing at Mark and Lisa, whose expressions reflected a complex mix of emotions. They seemed to be struggling with their own memories, perhaps recalling times when he had been there for them, always in the background, always dependable. Mark finally spoke, his voice thick with emotion. "Dad, I had no idea. I mean, I knew you worked hard, but I didn't realize what you went through, just so we could have a better life." Joseph gave a small nod, his expression filled with understanding. "It was never something I did for gratitude, Mark. I did it out of love. But sometimes, love doesn't require words. It just needs to be seen, acknowledged." His gaze softened. "You all have your lives now, and I'm proud of what you've built. I just want you to remember that the roots of this family go deeper than you may know. There are things that matter beyond wealth and success." As he finished speaking, a quiet reflection settled over the room. His family, so used to looking forward, now found themselves looking back, appreciating the man who had quietly shaped their lives. Joseph saw their expressions change, a shift from indifference to respect, as if his words had peeled away layers of assumption and revealed a truth they had long overlooked. For the first time, they saw him not as a relic of the past, but as the foundation upon which their lives had been built. But Joseph knew this was only the beginning. His story held more than tales of hardship. There were secrets he had kept, sacrifices he had made that remained hidden. He would reveal them in time, but not yet. For now, he wanted them to simply understand that he was not just grandpa, but a man with a life rich in experience, shaped by struggles they could scarcely imagine. And in their eyes, he saw that they were beginning to understand, to see him in a way they never had before. The room remained silent long after Joseph finished speaking. His family members, once busy with their conversations and their digital distractions, now sat quietly, lost in thought. Mark and Lisa exchanged glances, a look of shared regret passing between them as they took in the depth of what Joseph had shared. His words had stirred something within them, a realization that the life of ease they now enjoyed had come at a cost they had never fully understood. Joseph's gaze lingered on each family member, noting the subtle shifts in their expressions. He could see that his words had planted a seed, but he knew that understanding did not come easily, nor quickly. It would take time for them to fully appreciate the sacrifices he had made, and even longer for them to comprehend the deeper secrets he had yet to reveal. He took a deep breath, his heart steady, as he prepared to share more of his life with them, a life that had been defined by both hardship and resilience. Turning to his granddaughter Emily, Joseph offered a gentle smile. She had always been his confidant, the one family member who sought his wisdom and appreciated his stories. Her eyes shone with pride and a hint of sadness as she listened to him, as though sensing the weight he carried. Emily reached for his hand, giving it a supportive squeeze, her silent encouragement urging him to continue. She knew, as he did, that his story was far from over. Joseph's voice softened as he began to share another chapter of his life. "After my parents passed, I was left to take care of my younger siblings," he said, his gaze drifting as memories from long ago resurfaced. I worked at a factory from dawn until night, barely making enough to feed us. There were days when we only had one meal, and that was shared among 3 people. But I promised myself I wouldn't let my family go hungry, even if it meant I went without. The grandchildren exchanged glances, visibly struck by the image of their grandfather, this quiet, gentle man they had always known, enduring such hardship. For the first time, they saw him not just as a kindly old man, but as someone who had weathered storms they could barely imagine. The luxury they took for granted, the abundance of food, the warmth of a home, the ease of their lives, all of it had been made possible by his sacrifices that had remained hidden until now. Mark shifted in his seat, visibly uncomfortable. He opened his mouth to speak, then hesitated, his usual confidence replaced by something more vulnerable. "Dad, I never knew things were that hard for you. I knew you worked hard, but I had no idea you went through all of that," he murmured, his voice thick with regret. Joseph gave him a kind, understanding nod. "It's not something I expected you to know, Mark. These things happened long before you were born. But it's important for you to understand where you come from." Joseph continued, his words drawing his family further into his past. He spoke of the years he spent building a small savings, penny by penny, so that his siblings could go to school, so they would have a chance at a better life. "It took years," he said, his voice steady but filled with quiet pride. "Years of saving and sacrificing, of putting their needs above my own. And when I finally managed to get them through school, I felt a joy I can't even describe. They had a chance to do what I never could." As he spoke, Lisa's eyes filled with tears. She could feel the depth of his sacrifices, the way he had placed others above himself time and time again. She remembered the times she had brushed off his advice, assuming he couldn't understand the pressures of modern life. But now, she realized that his wisdom came from a place of true experience, that he had known struggles far greater than anything she had ever faced. One of the younger grandchildren, Emma, raised her hand hesitantly, her face filled with curiosity and admiration. "Grandpa, did you ever get to go to school?" she asked softly. Joseph's face softened as he shook his head. "No, my dear. I didn't. By the time my siblings were settled, I was already too old, and life had other plans for me. But I don't regret it. My sacrifice gave them opportunities. And in a way, I lived through them, seeing the world from their eyes." Joseph paused, a faint smile touching his lips as he glanced at his family, his heart swelling with both love and pride. "What I learned wasn't from books, but from life itself," he continued. "I learned that real strength isn't just about pushing through hardship, it's about giving, about lifting others even when you're barely standing yourself. And I hope that one day, each of you will understand that there are some things worth more than wealth or success." His words left the room in silence once again, each member of his family lost in their own thoughts, their previous conversations forgotten. Joseph's voice held no bitterness, only the wisdom of someone who had lived a life defined by resilience and sacrifice. He had shared with them the essence of who he was, and they were beginning to see that their grandfather was far more than just the quiet man in the corner of the room. Emily looked at her grandfather, her heart heavy with both admiration and sorrow. She knew his story wasn't finished, that there were parts he hadn't shared, parts that perhaps even she hadn't heard. She squeezed his hand gently, a silent encouragement to keep going, to let them understand the depth of his life. He gave her a grateful smile, drawing strength from her presence as he prepared to reveal the next piece of his story. As he glanced around the room, Joseph felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. He had finally been given a moment to share his life, to show his family the journey that had shaped him. But deep down, he knew that the greatest revelation was still to come, a truth that would surprise them all, a legacy he had carefully preserved. For now, he would let them absorb what he had shared, letting the seeds of understanding grow. As the evening continued, the mood in the room shifted from one of passive listening to a quiet reverence. Joseph's family watched him with newfound respect, their faces marked by the weight of the stories he had shared. For decades, they had viewed him as nothing more than Grandpa, a figure who existed on the periphery of their lives, but tonight, he was revealing depths they hadn't known existed. Yet, beneath their growing admiration, a curiosity sparked, an eagerness to understand what else he was keeping from them, what hidden parts of his past still lingered in the shadows. Emily, ever perceptive, sensed this curiosity too, but she was cautious. She knew her grandfather's gentle heart, knew how much pain he had quietly borne over the years. She glanced at him, offering a look of support, but he seemed lost in thought, his gaze fixed on the ground as if wrestling with an invisible burden. She wondered what secrets lay unspoken, what truths he had yet to share. Though she trusted him completely, a tiny spark of anticipation flared in her heart, sensing that the most profound revelations were still ahead. Finally, Mark, emboldened by the stories he'd heard, leaned forward, his expression both curious and uncertain. "Dad, I think we'd all like to know more," he said hesitantly, his voice softer than usual. "I mean, hearing about everything you went through, it puts so much into perspective. But I get the feeling there's something more. Is there something else you're not telling us?" His words hung in the air, laden with both respect and a gentle nudge for more. Joseph looked at his son, his eyes reflecting a mix of pride and sorrow. He knew the time would come when they would want answers, when the quiet understanding he had offered over the years would no longer suffice. Yet, he hesitated. The memories he held were not just stories, they were a tapestry woven with pain, sacrifice, and, ultimately, a choice that had changed the course of his life. Revealing it meant exposing a part of himself that he had hidden, even from those closest to him. "Some things are hard to share, even after all these years," Joseph began, his voice steady but tinged with a sadness that was impossible to ignore. "There are choices I made that I've questioned every day, decisions that shaped who I am and, ultimately, what I was able to offer each of you." He paused, gathering his thoughts as he looked around the room. His family leaned in, drawn by the gravity of his words, each one sensing that they were about to learn something deeply personal, something that had defined their family in ways they had never realized. Lisa shifted uneasily, as if uncomfortable with the vulnerability in her father-in-law's voice. She had always seen him as unshakable, a figure who seemed to glide through life with a quiet strength. But now, hearing the cracks in his voice, she realized how little she truly understood about him. Her mind raced with questions, wondering what secrets this gentle man could possibly harbor. She glanced at Mark, who returned her look, both of them sensing the weight of the moment. Taking a steadying breath, Joseph continued, his gaze distant as if looking back into a world they couldn't see. "When I was younger, I dreamed of a life filled with adventure and freedom, of exploring the world and making something of myself. But life had other plans. When my parents passed, my dreams faded, replaced by the reality of survival and responsibility. I made a promise to take care of my siblings, to give them the life I never had, and that meant sacrificing my own dreams." The younger family members, who had grown up with every opportunity at their fingertips, listened with rapt attention, struggling to imagine a life so limited by duty. To them, the idea of giving up their ambitions for the sake of family seemed foreign, even daunting. They couldn't fathom the strength it took to put aside everything they desired in order to ensure the well-being of others. For the first time, they saw Joseph as a man shaped by choices they could barely comprehend. Joseph's voice grew softer, his words deliberate. "I don't regret taking care of my siblings, but there were sacrifices I made that I didn't anticipate. When I met your mother," he continued, turning to Mark, "she was my reason for believing in a different future. I wanted to give her everything, to build a life that reflected the dreams I once had. But by then, the years of sacrifice had worn on me, and I realized I couldn't build that life for her, not the way I wanted to. I had to accept that some dreams were not meant for me." Mark's face softened, a flicker of sorrow crossing his features. He had always looked up to his father, but he'd never fully appreciated the sacrifices that had shaped his life. "Dad, I didn't know," he murmured, his voice laced with regret. "I just assumed. I never realized how much you gave up." Joseph nodded, a gentle smile gracing his lips. "It wasn't something I did for thanks, Mark. It was something I did out of love. And I'd do it all again." But then, Joseph's gaze grew distant, his expression clouded with an unspoken sadness. He knew that the story he had shared was only part of the truth. There were deeper choices he had made, choices that carried a cost he had never revealed. There was something more, something hidden, tied to his family's future, something they would only understand when the time was right. He sensed their curiosity, their longing to know, but he held back, knowing that some secrets needed time to reveal their purpose. As he looked around the room, Joseph felt both the love and the weight of the expectations his family placed upon him. They wanted answers, clarity, and closure. But life, he knew, was rarely so simple. There was more to his story, more than he could put into words in a single evening. For now, he had shared enough, planting seeds of understanding that he hoped would blossom in time. As the evening wore on, the atmosphere in the room grew heavy with a mix of curiosity, sorrow, and reverence. Joseph's words had unlocked a door to a part of him they'd never seen, yet his family sensed there was still more he hadn't revealed. Each of them, in their own way, was drawn to the mystery of his past, to the sacrifices that had shaped their lives without them ever knowing. Joseph looked around the room, aware of their unspoken questions but also of his own reluctance to reveal everything just yet. Mark, his eldest son, sat quietly, his usually confident expression softened, his gaze fixed on his father with an intensity that bordered on regret. For so long, he had seen his father as a constant, someone whose presence he could rely on but not necessarily need to acknowledge. Now, Mark found himself grappling with an unfamiliar sense of guilt, realizing how often he had dismissed his father's quiet strength as simply part of the background. "Dad, I don't think any of us understood the extent of what you went through," Mark said, breaking the silence. His voice was low, almost reverent. "We never really thought about the life you had before us. I think I just assumed you'd always been this way, that you didn't have dreams or regrets." He hesitated, then added, "But I see now how much you've kept from us, and I can't help but wonder why." Joseph gave his son a small, understanding smile. "It's not that I wanted to keep secrets, Mark," he replied, his voice gentle. "But sometimes, the things we hold closest are the hardest to share. There were moments in my life that defined who I became, moments that required me to make choices I never anticipated. And some of those choices were painful, things I didn't want to burden any of you with." Emily, who had been listening intently, spoke up, her voice filled with a mixture of admiration and sadness. "Grandpa, I think we all wish we'd known sooner. Maybe if we'd understood what you went through, we would have appreciated you more." Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears, and Joseph could see the love and respect she held for him, feelings she expressed more openly than anyone else in the family. Joseph reached for Emily's hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "You've always been kind, Emily. And that kindness is more than enough. I never wanted any of you to look back and feel sorrow for me. I made my choices out of love, not out of duty or obligation." He paused, his gaze moving around the room, meeting each of their eyes with a steady resolve. "But I understand now that some of these things need to be spoken, if only so you know the truth of where you came from." Lisa shifted in her seat, visibly moved by Joseph's words, her expression a mixture of empathy and regret. She thought back to the times she had assumed his quietness was indifference, or perhaps the absence of anything meaningful to say. Now she realized how wrong she had been. "I think we've all misunderstood you, Dad," she admitted softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "We should have tried harder to know you, to understand everything you've done for us." Joseph's smile was gentle, his eyes filled with a compassion that came from a lifetime of loving without expecting anything in return. "It's easy to overlook the quiet things in life, Lisa. We're all drawn to what's bright and loud, to the things that capture our attention. But often, it's in the quiet moments that the most important things are built, the things that last." His gaze softened, and for a moment, a flicker of sadness passed over his face, as though he were remembering something distant, something he had never fully let go of. After a long pause, he took a deep breath and continued. "There's one more thing I want to share with you tonight," he said, his voice steady but filled with a heaviness that made everyone sit up a little straighter. "It's something I've held onto for many years, a promise I made to someone very dear to me, someone who shaped the person I became. It's a part of my life that I kept hidden because it wasn't easy to remember." The room fell silent, and the anticipation grew thick as Joseph's family waited, sensing that he was on the verge of revealing something deeply personal, something that went beyond his sacrifices and choices. They watched him with rapt attention, their own questions and concerns momentarily forgotten as they waited for him to speak. His face grew somber, his eyes reflecting a sadness that seemed to reach far into his past, to memories that had long haunted him. When I was young, I fell in love with someone, he began, his voice soft yet filled with an unmistakable emotion. She was a kind soul, someone who understood me in a way no one else did. We made promises to each other, promises we intended to keep. But life had different plans. Circumstances forced us to part ways, and I made a choice to let her go, knowing that my responsibilities came first. Joseph's words hung in the air, and his family listened, captivated by the story of a love they had never known he'd experienced. He looked away, his gaze distant as if he could see her face, remember her laughter, the touch of her hand. It wasn't an easy decision, he continued. But I knew I couldn't give her the life she deserved. And so, I let her go, knowing that in doing so, I was losing a part of myself. That choice shaped me more than anything else, because it taught me the meaning of sacrifice. Lisa's hand went to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears as she imagined the pain he must have felt. The family sat in silence, each of them moved by the realization that Joseph had carried this sorrow quietly, never letting on to the heartbreak that had once defined him. They had known him only as a father, as a provider, but now they saw him as a man with dreams and losses, with unspoken promises and hidden memories. Joseph gave a small, sad smile, his gaze returning to his family. I kept that promise in my heart all these years, not out of regret, but as a reminder that love sometimes requires us to let go. It's a lesson I hope you never have to learn, but it's one that taught me the true meaning of devotion. His family sat in stunned silence, their own emotions raw as they absorbed his words, feeling both the weight of his loss and the strength of his love. The room was heavy with silence, each family member lost in the depths of Joseph's story. His words about the love he had sacrificed settled over them like a gentle but unshakable weight, filling the room with a quiet sorrow. For the first time, they saw not just a man who had cared for them, but a man who had sacrificed his own happiness in ways they had never imagined. The revelation left them with a profound respect, tempered by a deep sadness that he had carried this memory alone for so long. Joseph, sitting quietly in his chair, seemed to shrink into himself, his eyes distant as though he were reliving memories that felt as fresh as they did painful. The love he had given up, the life he had let slip away, all for the sake of duty and responsibility, left him with a bittersweet smile on his lips. He had made peace with that choice long ago, but he realized that in sharing it now, he was unburdening himself in a way he hadn't anticipated. For years, the story had been his alone. Now, it was theirs as well. Emily's voice broke the silence, her face filled with a sadness and admiration beyond her years. "Grandpa," she whispered, "I don't think I could have ever done what you did. I can't imagine loving someone so deeply and having to let them go." Her words echoed the sentiment in everyone's heart, an awe at the strength he had shown, a strength that went beyond endurance and touched the very core of what it meant to love selflessly. Joseph gave her a gentle nod, his eyes glistening with tears he didn't bother to hide. "It wasn't easy, Emily," he replied, his voice soft and fragile. "But sometimes, love isn't about holding on. It's about giving someone the freedom to live their life, even if it means you're left behind. I had to trust that the life I was building would matter, even if it was different from the one I had once dreamed of." Mark, sitting beside his wife Lisa, seemed to struggle with this new perspective on his father. All his life, he had been taught to pursue his own dreams, to push forward, never to settle. Yet here was his father, a man who had surrendered everything for others, his entire life shaped by choices made not for himself, but for those he loved. Mark felt both admiration and guilt, admiration for his father's strength, and guilt for the ways he had dismissed him as outdated, as a relic of another time. Lisa, her eyes red with tears, looked at Joseph with a newfound respect. She had once thought him simple, someone who had never lived the way she and Mark had, someone whose choices had been small and limited. But now, she realized that his life had been filled with a different kind of bravery, one that she had never fully appreciated. His sacrifices were woven into the lives of everyone in the room, and she felt humbled by the depth of his love and resilience. One of the younger grandchildren, a teenage boy named Jacob, leaned forward, a look of curiosity and reverence on his face. "Did you ever see her again, Grandpa?" he asked quietly, his tone respectful but filled with an innocent curiosity. "The woman you loved?" His question surprised everyone, but Joseph didn't seem bothered by it. Instead, he looked at Jacob with a sad, fond smile, as though seeing a glimpse of himself in the young boy's eager eyes. "No, Jacob," Joseph replied, his voice steady. "Our paths never crossed again. Sometimes, life takes us in different directions, and all we're left with are the memories. I have no regrets, though. She went on to live her life, and I went on to build ours. In the end, I think that was the truest expression of love I could have given her." His words were simple, but they carried a depth of meaning that left the family in quiet contemplation, each of them reflecting on the nature of love, loss, and sacrifice. Joseph's gaze grew distant again, and he seemed to retreat into his thoughts, as though the story he had shared had taken more from him than he expected. Emily noticed, and, sensing his fatigue, gently took his hand, squeezing it reassuringly. "Thank you for sharing that with us, Grandpa," she said softly, her voice filled with gratitude. "I think we all needed to hear it." He gave her a grateful smile, a warmth in his eyes that spoke of his love for her, for all of them. But beneath that warmth, there was still something hidden, a secret he wasn't yet ready to reveal. While he had shared the story of his lost love, there was a deeper truth that remained unspoken, a truth tied to his life's work, to the legacy he had built quietly and without fanfare. He had planned for this moment, but he realized that they weren't ready to hear the full story, not yet. For now, he would let them sit with the memories he had given them, to let them reflect on the sacrifices they had only just begun to understand. As the evening wore on, the family began to disperse, each of them lost in their thoughts, touched by Joseph's words in ways they couldn't yet express. They would come to him, one by one, offering words of gratitude, of love, of newfound respect, but Joseph only nodded, his smile warm but distant. He knew the weight of his story, and he understood that it would take time for them to fully grasp the life he had lived. As the last of his family made their way to the door, Joseph remained in his chair, watching them with a quiet contentment. Emily lingered behind, giving him a final hug, her embrace filled with a love and respect that needed no words. When she left, he sat alone, his heart full, his mind clear, knowing that the greatest truth he held remained within him. For now, he was content to keep it there, waiting for the right moment, the perfect time to reveal the legacy he had kept hidden for so long. After that revealing evening, Joseph's family began to see him through a different lens, each of them affected by the unanticipated depth of his story. The family gatherings that followed were more thoughtful, with fewer interruptions and more listening. Joseph noticed the change, a subtle but meaningful shift. Mark and Lisa, who had once regarded him with a quiet detachment, now looked at him with respect, as if trying to understand the sacrifices that had built the foundation for their own lives. Joseph felt the warmth of their attention but knew that, deep down, his story was still unfinished. He had revealed the heartbreak and sacrifice of his youth, the love he had let go of for the sake of his family, but there was more, something that lay closer to his present, something that carried with it the weight of a lifetime of work and dedication. It was a secret he had nurtured quietly, like a seed planted in rich soil, waiting for the right time to blossom. One afternoon, Mark visited Joseph alone, an unusual occurrence that surprised him. Mark's face carried an expression of quiet resolve, as if he had been rehearsing his words. Joseph watched his son with a calm, knowing gaze, sensing that Mark had come with questions. "Dad," Mark began, his voice tentative. "I've been thinking a lot about what you told us. About the sacrifices you made, and the life you gave up. It's been hard for me to understand, but I'm trying." Joseph nodded, understanding the struggle within his son. "I appreciate that, Mark. It's not easy to look at someone's life and see the choices that were made, especially when they are so different from your own." He leaned forward, his expression gentle. "But remember, each generation has its own burdens, its own decisions to face. What I chose may seem distant to you, but it was real for me. And I did it all with the hope that your lives would be free from those kinds of choices." Mark's face softened, a flicker of gratitude mixed with guilt crossing his features. "Dad, I realize now how much we've taken you for granted. I think I spent most of my life focused on success, on making something of myself, without really considering where it all came from." He paused, his voice heavy with emotion. "But I want to know more. I feel like there's still something you haven't told us, something important." Joseph's gaze met Mark's, his eyes steady but guarded. He had known this moment would come, had prepared for it in his heart, yet it still felt daunting to reveal the truth he had kept so carefully hidden. "You're right, Mark," he replied slowly. "There is something more, something I have kept close to my heart for many years. But it's not something I can explain in just a few words. It's a story that spans decades." Mark listened intently, his curiosity tempered by respect, as he sensed the gravity of his father's words. Joseph took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts, then began to speak. "After your mother passed, I spent a lot of time reflecting on the life we had built together, the family we raised. I realized that my life's work wasn't just about the sacrifices I made in the past, but about the legacy I wanted to leave for the future." Mark's brow furrowed in confusion. "Legacy? What do you mean, Dad?" Joseph's expression grew thoughtful, his gaze turning inward as he continued. "There was a piece of land, not far from where I grew up. It was a modest plot, but it held a special meaning for me, a connection to my past, to the dreams I once had." He paused, letting the words sink in. "After your mother passed, I purchased that land with the savings I had set aside over the years. And ever since, I've been working quietly to turn it into something meaningful." Mark's curiosity deepened, but he held his questions, sensing that his father needed to speak without interruption. Joseph continued, his voice steady. "4 years, I've been working on that land, building a small community center. It's a place for children who don't have the opportunities one dreamed of when I was young, a place where they can learn, grow, and have a chance to build a future for themselves." His voice softened, filled with both pride and humility. "I wanted to create something that would outlast me, something that would give back to the world in a way that my sacrifices alone never could." Mark's face showed a mixture of awe and disbelief. He had always known his father as a man of quiet strength, but this revelation added a layer of depth he hadn't expected. "Dad, why didn't you tell us?" he asked, his voice filled with wonder. "Why keep something like this a secret?" Joseph gave a gentle smile, his eyes filled with understanding. "Because, Mark, it wasn't about recognition. I didn't do it for thanks or acknowledgement. I did it because it was the right thing to do. And because I wanted you and your siblings to live your lives freely, without the weight of expectations or obligations. I wanted this to be something that would stand on its own, independent of my family." As Joseph spoke, Mark felt a profound respect bloom within him, a respect that went beyond admiration and reached into the core of his being. His father's life was a testament to humility, to the quiet dignity of serving without expecting anything in return. Mark realized, with a pang of regret, how he had misunderstood his father for so long, how he had mistaken his silence for simplicity rather than depth. Joseph placed a hand on Mark's shoulder, his gaze steady. "One day, this land and everything I've built will pass to you and your siblings. But I want you to understand that it's not just a gift, it's a responsibility. It's a reminder of the lives that came before you, of the sacrifices that shaped your future." His voice was filled with a quiet intensity. "I hope you will carry it forward, that you will remember the legacy that built this family and honor it in your own way." Mark felt a lump in his throat, unable to speak. He nodded, his mind swirling with emotions he couldn't yet put into words. For the first time, he saw his father not just as a provider, but as a man whose life was a mosaic of silent sacrifices, of love expressed through action rather than words. And he knew, with a certainty that reached deep into his soul, that he would do everything in his power to honor the legacy his father had built. As Joseph's words settled over Mark, a newfound respect began to grow within him. Mark had always understood his father's life as one of sacrifice, but he'd never considered it could also be a life of dreams, of plans set into motion in quiet corners and built piece by piece over the years. The revelation of the community center was a twist in the story Mark had always known. It wasn't just a place, it was a symbol of everything his father had stood for. A legacy not spoken of but crafted with purpose and love. The next day, Mark couldn't shake his father's words. He decided to visit Joseph at home, hoping to learn more about this place that had been kept from them for so long. When he arrived, he found his father sitting by the window, gazing out with an expression that held both contentment and contemplation. Mark approached him gently, as though he were intruding on a moment meant for solitude. "Dad," he said softly, his voice breaking Joseph's reverie. Joseph turned to him, a warm smile lighting up his face. "Hello, son," he greeted, his eyes twinkling with understanding. He knew why Mark had come back. The weight of his legacy, now partially revealed, had ignited something within his son, a need to understand, to see for himself the fruits of his father's quiet labor. Joseph gestured to a seat beside him, inviting Mark to sit. "I imagine you have questions," he said, his voice calm, steady. Mark nodded, searching for the right words. "I keep thinking about everything you told me," he began, his voice filled with a mix of wonder and hesitation. "The community center, the land, it's like a whole part of you we never knew existed. And I want to see it, Dad. I want to understand it." The sincerity in his voice touched Joseph deeply. He had always hoped, silently and without expectation, that his family would one day be ready to embrace this part of his life. Joseph gave a thoughtful nod, as if weighing Mark's request. "Very well," he replied, his voice warm yet tinged with emotion. "Tomorrow, we'll visit the land together. It's time you see it with your own eyes." He placed a hand on his son's shoulder, his gaze filled with pride and trust. "But remember, Mark, this is not just a piece of land or a building. It's a promise, a place where dreams grow, where hope is nurtured." The following morning, they set out early, the air crisp and cool. As they drove, Joseph was uncharacteristically quiet, his eyes fixed on the road ahead as if lost in thought. Mark felt a sense of anticipation mixed with a hint of nervousness. He realized that he was about to step into a part of his father's life that had remained hidden for so long. It felt almost sacred, and he wondered how he would react, how he would feel seeing the tangible legacy his father had spent years crafting in silence. When they arrived, Mark was struck by the beauty of the land. It was nestled in a quiet valley, surrounded by trees that seemed to stand as sentinels, guarding the peace of the place. There, amid the greenery, stood a modest but beautiful building, the community center his father had spoken of. It was simple, yet it had an elegance about it, a structure that seemed to belong to the landscape as if it had always been part of it. Mark felt a pang of emotion as he took it in, realizing the countless hours of work and love that had gone into creating it. Joseph led him through the doors, and inside, Mark saw rooms filled with books, art supplies, and small desks arranged for learning. The walls were adorned with paintings and photographs, scenes of joy and creativity, capturing the lives of children and families who had passed through the center. There were shelves lined with donated clothing, shoes, and supplies, along with a small kitchen where meals were prepared and shared. It was a place that breathed life, a sanctuary created for those who needed it most. Mark looked around, his heart swelling with both pride and humility. "Dad, this is incredible," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I can't believe you built all of this on your own. And you never asked for help, never told us." His voice trailed off, overcome by the enormity of what his father had accomplished without recognition or acknowledgement. Joseph gave a gentle smile, his gaze thoughtful. "It wasn't about recognition, Mark," he replied softly. "This place was born from a promise, a vow I made to myself long ago. I wanted to create something that could give back to the world, a place where anyone, regardless of their background, could find hope and kindness." He looked around, a deep satisfaction in his eyes. "Every brick, every piece of this building, is a testament to the sacrifices I made. And I would do it all again if it meant others could have a chance at a better life." Mark's eyes brimmed with unshed tears as he looked at his father, his heart full of admiration and love. He realized now how deeply he had misunderstood his father, how he had dismissed him as a man of simple routines and outdated ideals. But here, in this place built from selflessness and dedication, he saw the truth. His father's life was rich, profound, and filled with a wisdom he had only just begun to understand. They walked through the center together, Joseph showing him the classrooms, the small library, the art room where children created colorful murals. As they passed through each room, Mark felt a deep reverence, sensing the impact this place had on the lives of those who visited. He could feel the love his father had poured into every corner, a love that extended beyond family to encompass strangers, to reach out to those in need. As Joseph and Mark continued walking through the community center, Mark's understanding of his father deepened with every step. He began to see his father not just as dad, but as a man of vision, someone whose quiet life had hidden a depth of purpose and compassion that few people could ever claim. The walls of the community center seemed to pulse with life, each room carrying the energy of the children and families who had found hope within its walls. Mark's mind swirled with questions. He wanted to know how long his father had been working on this project, how he'd managed to keep it a secret, and what had driven him to build it in the first place. But he held his questions, letting the silence between them speak. For the first time, he understood that this was a place not built for acknowledgement but as a silent testament to his father's life, a legacy planted without expectation. They stopped in front of a mural painted by children from the community, a swirling mix of colors depicting scenes of hope and togetherness. Joseph reached out, his hand brushing the edge of the mural, a gentle smile tugging at his lips. "I remember when this was painted," he said softly, his eyes reflecting the memory. The children worked on it for weeks. Every color, every brushstroke, came from their hearts. They knew this was a place they could belong, a place where they mattered. Mark felt his throat tighten as he listened, sensing the quiet pride in his father's voice. "Dad," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, how did you do all of this on your own?" His words were laden with awe and regret, as he realized just how much his father had poured into this place without ever asking for help, without ever seeking acknowledgement. Joseph smiled, his eyes wise and calm. "When you have a purpose, Mark, the work doesn't feel like a burden," he replied. "I started with what little savings I had, bit by bit. And over the years, as people saw what I was doing, they joined in, donating time, supplies, anything they could give. It was never just me. This place grew because of the kindness of others." He looked at Mark, his gaze filled with understanding. "Sometimes, when you set something good in motion, the world has a way of helping it grow." Mark nodded, his mind racing with everything he was learning. His father's words resonated within him, planting seeds of their own, urging him to consider the ways he might carry this legacy forward. He realized that his father had spent his life not in pursuit of material success, but in creating a space where kindness and hope could thrive, where the lives of those less fortunate could be changed forever. As they walked into the library, Joseph paused in front of a small plaque on the wall. The plaque bore an inscription, dedicated to the dreamers, the givers, and the seekers of light. Mark traced the words with his fingers, feeling the weight of their meaning. This place, he realized, was more than a building. It was a sanctuary, a refuge created by someone who understood the value of hope. And here, in these walls, his father's quiet, steadfast heart lived on. "Why didn't you ever tell us, Dad?" Mark asked, his voice filled with a mixture of sadness and admiration. "We could have helped you, could have supported you in some way." Joseph turned to him, a gentle smile on his face. "Because, Mark, I wanted this to be something separate from my family, something that would stand on its own. I didn't want you or your siblings to feel obligated, to carry it as a burden. This was my gift to the world, my way of giving back for the opportunities one was never able to have." Mark's chest tightened as he listened, each word filling him with a profound respect for his father. He had spent years pursuing his own ambitions, measuring success by wealth and status, never realizing that true success lay in quiet acts of generosity, in building something that could outlast oneself. His father had built this place, not for recognition or legacy, but because he understood the importance of giving without expecting anything in return. They moved into the kitchen, where a few volunteers were busy preparing meals for the families who would come by that evening. Joseph introduced Mark to them, each person greeting him warmly, speaking of Joseph with an admiration that left Mark humbled. These were people who had worked alongside his father, who had witnessed his dedication and kindness firsthand. He felt a swell of pride, knowing that his father was cherished by so many. Before leaving, they sat together in the small courtyard behind the community center. Joseph looked around, taking in the building with a sense of fulfillment and peace. "This place," he said quietly, "is not just for the present. It's a place where future generations can come, where they can find hope when they have none. I may not be around forever, Mark, but I want this place to stand as a reminder of what matters most in life." Mark looked at his father, feeling a depth of love and respect he had never known before. "Dad, I promise you," he said, his voice firm with conviction, "I'll make sure this place continues." I'll do everything I can to honor what you've built here." His words were a vow, a commitment to the legacy his father had created, a legacy that had been years in the making, nurtured in silence and selflessness. Joseph nodded, his heart full, his mind at peace. He had waited his entire life to pass on this dream, to see his family understand the meaning behind his work. And now, knowing that Mark would carry it forward, he felt a sense of fulfillment that went beyond words. The community center, the children, the families, it was all part of the life he had dedicated to serving others, a life that would continue to inspire long after he was gone. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the center, Mark and Joseph stood side by side, looking out over the land. They didn't need to speak, the understanding between them was deep and complete. They both knew that this place was more than a legacy, it was a gift of love, a testament to a life lived with purpose. And as they turned to leave, Mark felt the weight of that gift, a weight he was now ready to carry forward. In the weeks that followed, Mark found himself returning to the community center with a renewed sense of purpose. His visits became more frequent, each one drawing him closer to his father's vision. He began to understand the impact of the work Joseph had quietly devoted himself to, the countless lives touched by his generosity. The children who laughed in the art room, the parents who found support in the classes, the volunteers who came and went with smiles of gratitude, all of them had found a second home here, a safe place built from his father's unspoken love. One quiet afternoon, Joseph asked Mark to join him for a meeting with the center's board of volunteers. Joseph's steps were slower now, and Mark found himself offering his arm as they walked through the building. Joseph leaned on him gratefully, a soft smile gracing his lips, his eyes bright with pride. Mark sensed that this meeting was more than routine. It was Joseph's way of preparing him to take on a role that was both humbling and monumental. The boardroom was modest, filled with people who had worked alongside Joseph for years. They greeted him warmly, some with tears in their eyes as they realized the significance of this meeting. Joseph cleared his throat, his voice gentle but filled with authority. "I wanted to speak with all of you today because I believe it's time for me to step back," he said, his voice tinged with both sadness and peace. "The center has been a part of my life for years, but I believe it's now ready to stand without me." Mark looked at his father, feeling the weight of his words settle over him. Joseph reached for Mark's hand, a silent gesture that spoke volumes. "Mark has shown a dedication to this place that fills me with hope. I know that under his guidance, the center will continue to grow, to become even more than I could have ever imagined." Joseph's words were met with nods and murmurs of support, the room filling with a warmth that enveloped them all. After the meeting, as they walked slowly through the halls, Joseph spoke quietly to Mark. "This center isn't just a building, son. It's a symbol of hope, of compassion. I've seen lives change here, seen people find purpose and healing. I trust you to carry that forward, to ensure that it remains a place where everyone feels welcome and valued." Mark nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "I won't let you down, Dad. I'll honor everything you've built." The days passed peacefully, with Joseph spending more time at the center, each visit bittersweet as he said quiet goodbyes to the staff and volunteers who had become his second family. But Mark could see the weariness in his father's eyes, the quiet acceptance that his work was nearly done. Joseph's body had grown frailer, his steps slower, yet his spirit was unwavering. He had poured his heart into this place, and he was ready to leave it in the hands of those who would carry his legacy forward. One evening, as Mark sat with his father on the porch of Joseph's modest home, the sky painted in hues of pink and orange, Joseph took Mark's hand in his own. His grip was weak, but his gaze was steady. "Mark," he said softly, "when I was young, I dreamed of a life that mattered, one that would leave something meaningful behind. I may not have had wealth or fame, but I hope I have lived in a way that brings goodness into the world." Mark's eyes filled with tears as he nodded. "Dad, you've done more than that. You've changed lives. You built something that will continue long after we're gone. You've given this family a legacy of kindness, of strength, of love." Joseph smiled, a deep, contented smile that reflected a life well lived. "Then I've achieved my dream, son," he whispered. "And now, I trust you to keep that dream alive." As the days turned into weeks, Joseph's health declined, his final days spent in quiet reflection and peace, surrounded by his family. Emily was often by his side, holding his hand, her heart filled with both sorrow and gratitude. She had always known her grandfather's gentle spirit, but now she understood the depth of his love, the strength of his purpose. When Joseph passed, the family gathered at the community center to honor him, each of them carrying his legacy within them. The center was filled with people whose lives he had touched, a testament to his quiet, powerful impact. Mark stood at the front, looking out at the faces of those who had come to pay their respects, feeling the weight of his father's legacy now resting on his own shoulders. He spoke of Joseph's life, of the sacrifices and dreams that had built this place, and promised to carry forward the values his father had instilled in him. In the months that followed, Mark dedicated himself to the center, his heart and mind forever changed by his father's life. He expanded its programs, adding services for young mothers, education workshops, and even job training courses. Everywhere he looked, he saw Joseph's influence, his spirit woven into the fabric of the place. Years later, as Mark walked through the center, he paused at the plaque his father had placed on the wall years ago. Dedicated to the dreamers, the givers, and the seekers of light. He ran his fingers over the words, feeling the steady strength of his father's presence, knowing that Joseph's dream was alive and thriving. And so, Joseph's legacy lived on, a legacy of quiet sacrifice, of resilience, and, most of all, of love. If you like this story, take the opportunity to see the others that are appearing on your screen right now. Subscribe to the channel and comment on what you thought of this story. See you soon. Bye.